Douglas Murray, it is such an honor to have you join us. We've been talking a while. I'd invited you to speak at our anti-Semitism conference, I think is when I first reached out to you. And then that was in a different lifetime. I've read Strange Death of Europe and then Madness of Crowds, which is beyond superb. And when I read it, I told everybody this is even pre-COVID, pre what we're living through now, and said this explains everything that we're going through. So when all this came down, I thought the perfect person is you. I'm so glad you're able to join us. Your book covers various kinds of identity politics that's being imposed on us, the gender, race, trans, all of that. But for our purposes today, I wanted to talk about racism, not necessarily that it's existing, but how it's used politically. If you could start with that, racism, how Kanye West isn't really black, how Joe Biden says you ain't black if you don't know who you're voting for, and so on. If you could jump in there, that'd be great. And welcome.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Karen, and thank you to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be back with you all, and albeit virtually these days, but it's an enormous pleasure. It really is, and I'm conscious of the hour where you are, and salute your indefatigability, as they say. Yes, well, let me just say, first of all, that, I mean, this has been an extraordinary year. It's, we're not even, just about halfway through, aren't we? And more has happened in this half a year than in many decades. So there's a lot to chew over in the time we have. But I just wanted to say that when the whole COVID thing began, a number of us who'd been sort of thinking and talking about identity politics issues for some time had, I think, a similar instinct, which was maybe this is the thing that sees it off. Maybe all of these sort of, all the talk of I'd always thought it was that the whole woke thing was in a sort of a rich society's privileged game. That, because throughout most of human history, nobody gave a damn if you thought you'd suffered a microaggression. Most of human history, nobody gave a damn if you'd suffered an aggression.
Right.
So here we were in this strange place where people could stop everything around them if they just could say that they felt that something had happened that was slightly troubling, to use the vernacular of the time. Now, as I say, when the COVID thing came, and the first expectations, the first extrapolations of the data of what people thought might be the death tolls in societies like ours, I think a number of us thought, maybe this just finishes this off among much else, because an age where everybody has serious complaints might be one where they don't have very much time for rather frivolous complaints. An era where matters of life and death and putting food on the table or not might just see off the people who keep asking us to pay attention to really minuscule issues. And that was one of my first instincts. I didn't have enormous faith in it happening, but I thought, well, that could be it. And then as lockdown went on, a number of things started to happen that just suggested that might not be the case. My early warning signs were these: people using COVID as another instrument in their identity politics wars. For instance, we were told early on that women were suffering more from the virus than men. And then when the stats showed that actually males had a higher likelihood of mortality from it than females, the same people said, well, the men might be doing the dying, but the women are doing the suffering in some other way. And so you thought, well, okay, you're just using the latest one, the latest tool to perpetuate this endless war of the sexes against each other. And then we had the one of higher death tolls in Black and ethnic minority communities, what in Britain now we call BAME communities.
Which is BAME is Black?
Black, Asian minority ethnic. Actually, we've only just learned to say BAME, and already apparently BAME is on the way out. So apparently there's a new acronym coming down the road at us already. So if you didn't say BAME this year, you're a racist, and if you do within another fortnight, you'll be a racist. So anyhow, the BAME figures in the UK and like in the US suddenly were fought over. Everyone was saying, why are these ethnic minority communities suffering more? Now, as it happens, the stats do seem to show that in the UK and I believe in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we might say, well, there might be all sorts of reasons for that, and we should look into them. Now, they might include pre-existing genetic issues. There might be pre-existent health issues. There are issues to do with diabetes and other things that are more prominent in certain communities than others. And there might, of course, be, and no one at all wants to talk about this one, but there might be something to do with not obeying lockdown in certain communities. Friends of mine in New York anecdotally say that from the very beginning, certain communities really didn't lock down and really were mixing a lot. Now, these might all be things that are worth looking into. But again, there was this very bad sign that people were writing about this as if the fact that there seems to be higher mortality rates from the virus among certain minority ethnic groups was evidence of racism. As if our societies can't even import a virus from Wuhan without giving it a racist spin, And this was, to my mind, a very worrying sign, because it suggested even when we went through something as serious as what we're going through with this virus, we still had this dominant view of our time of looking at it through these same tedious, reductive, zero-sum identity games. So that was what I was thinking as the lockdown was happening before the incident in Minnesota with George Floyd, that I thought, well, maybe nevertheless what will happen is the identity politics people will double down on their vision of society, but there may still be a wider societal response to it along the lines of, sure, you do your thing, but we've got other things to worry about, including unemployment figures and declining GDP and much, much more. Well, of course, the last month has shown that hope, as it were, was a flawed one, and that actually the first thing to break out as people were starting to get fed up of lockdown was the racial politics one, because of events in Minnesota. And now we see, having there been a certain muffling of these debates in the last few months, a sudden explosion of them out into the mainstream, so that Black Lives Matter, for instance, has got to places in the last few weeks it could never have done in years, it seemed to some of us. It's sped up incredibly fast. And yes, Karen, you're very kind of referred to the fact, I mean, I have been thinking about this and writing about it for some time, and mainly in the madness of crowds, because I worried about this fact that our societies, America, Britain, predominantly I would say the English-speaking countries, because we see the same thing in Canada and the same thing in Australia and New Zealand, were increasingly trying to interpret our societies through this lens, that the best way to understand the world was to understand power structures, hierarchies, and as I do in The Madness of Crowds, in chapter by chapter, along LGBT lines, along male-female lines, and along racial lines. And all of these things have had very similar things going on in them. And I'm conscious it's a slightly long answer to your question, but just to address the core of what you asked, I mean, this is the thing, as you know, that I noticed was happening in common in each of these areas, was that sometime in the last couple of decades, these identity issues stopped actually being about the identity, and they became solely about politics. And an early warning sign to me was when Germaine Greer became no longer a feminist.
Right.
And as I watched that, I thought, this is the most famous feminist of the late 20th century. She's been in the public eye for almost 50 years now. And whatever you think, is a remarkable figure and will be regarded as a very important historical figure. The moment at which people start saying, but Germaine Greer isn't a feminist, you have to say, what do you mean by feminist now?
Right.
Like, what are you talking about exactly? So that was one that I noticed early on. Well, why is that happening? Why is being a feminist become about something else? And then I noticed it happened in other areas. The example I give in The Madness of Crowds in the gay chapter is on Peter Thiel, the Silicon Valley tech billionaire who happens to be gay, and in 2016 happened to endorse Donald Trump as president at the Republican National Convention. And immediately after Peter Thiel stands on stage and says, I'm proud to be an American, I'm proud to be a gay man, I'm proud to be a Republican, the entirety of the gay press goes for Peter Thiel and chucks him out of the Church of Gay. The gay press says, no, he's not gay. Peter Thiel, in fact, One Piece, an advocate, the main American gay magazine, a legacy gay magazine, says Peter Thiel may sleep with men, which is one of these reductive things at the time. He may sleep with men, but in no way is he gay. And you go, well, in that case, these definitions are getting all over the place. I mean, exactly what are we talking about here?
What are we talking about?
And then the most interesting one, which you mentioned, the Kanye West example, is exactly the same thing happens with black. But now, of course, Kanye West isn't the first person this has happened to. You could easily argue that there is a long and ignoble tradition, in America in particular, of people saying that once somebody who is black is not of a very specific political tribe, they are no longer black. Now, of course, this happened with Clarence Thomas. It happened with Thomas Sowell. It happened with some very prominent American intellectuals and others who happen to be black. And I thought that the case of Kanye West was particularly interesting because this would have been, in fact, you could say it was one of the largest crossover events of the culture, because here was this superstar figure who doesn't even at first come out as some wild Republican or something. You know, he doesn't come out as a Donald Trump supporter. What he does is he doesn't go lockstep along the line he's meant to go along. And for that, Ta-Nehisi Coates, the most praised, I would say overpraised writer of his generation, writes at The Atlantic that Kanye West is not black. And I thought this was absolutely fascinating, because if Germaine Greer wasn't a feminist and Peter Thiel isn't gay and Kanye West isn't black, something else is going on. And I found this a very, very interesting corner. What I wanted to do then was to say, well, what is it that is going on underneath this? And furthermore, what caused it? And how might it be stopped? And you're quite right, Karen, to refer to the fact that this thing, the race chapter, I'm just horrified by the fact that, you know, there were texts I read when I was researching this book that I thought, they're known in academia, but the wider public doesn't want to know this stuff. And then in recent days, I see day in, day out reading lists being passed around. And I'm not just talking about, you know, canny publishing houses jumping on the opportunity to sell some of their backstock. I'm talking about large corporations, government entities, sending out lists to their employees saying, these are the books you should read. These, indeed, I got leaked this week. I just wrote about it today for my Spectator column this week. A letter from a National Health Service, the NHS executive in the city of Birmingham, an extraordinary letter to all employees telling them to read the following 4 books. One of which, top of the list, of course, is White Fragility,
right?
Which we may get onto. But as I say, that's one of the things that happened, is that these extraordinarily rarefied debate, they seemed to be rarefied, you know, just stuck on the odd liberal campus in America a few years ago, broke out into the rest of the academic world. Now, not just broke out through the popular culture, but through the culture entire. And I think that the last month has seen a progress of this, which I wouldn't have expected in years.
You wrote about, when you wrote about Evergreen and Yale, which were 2 of the most horrific examples of this kind of madness. We're all on campuses now, but now it seems it's even worse with the reading list you're talking about. We're all in re-education camps now.
That's right. And every day you hear, I mean, I'm sure that people with us who will be able to relay their own stories of this will be hearing from everywhere I go. I mean, you know, I'm now inundated with stories of people telling me what their children have been told at school. This morning, a friend showed me what their son, who's in primary school in the UK, was given. Said how and the parents were given things of how to talk to your children about George Floyd. But why would a British parent need to do that exactly? I don't. I mean, and people say to me, well, people don't know enough about X, Y. I said people don't know enough about anything. I mean, they don't.
Right.
I mean, I was speaking to a child recently who said they'd done the French Revolution in one lesson. You know, lots of people don't know stuff. But yeah, this re-education, and of course, what you learn now, and again, people there will have examples of this. But what we see at the moment is an extraordinary sight of not just the children being educated, but the parents being educated. So that
it's exactly right. It's the parents, it's the teachers, it's everyone.
And so we now have cases of, well, there was an example, if I say so, that I gave in the Madness of Crowds, which happened 2.5 years ago, which I thought didn't get enough attention. A NASCAR driver whose name I've forgotten, it's not my thing, but a NASCAR driver whose father was discovered to have used what is now an ethnic slur term on a radio program in the 1980s, and the son lost his sponsorship because of this. Now, this struck me, and that's why I wrote about it, although, you know, as I say, NASCAR writing isn't my thing particularly, but I wrote about it because I thought, well, that is a very sinister crossover.
Mm-hmm.
Because actually it's not even something we focus on much, we've taken it for granted. We have an understanding in our cultures that the sins of the father ethic is important, that you don't visit the sins of the father on the son, for instance.
Right.
Now on this occasion it became clear you could, now at least it seemed you could, and we've seen an extraordinary extension of this in recent days. We have a case in England of a man who flew, wisely or unwisely, a White Lives Matter banner behind a plane over a football match in Manchester. And that was because the team had all been wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts and the stadiums were empty because of COVID. And this guy hired a plane to do this White Lives Matter Burnley banner. Not only did he lose his job, his girlfriend was fired from her job, and she had a different job in a totally separate area. So once we're in that kind of area where children can be punished for what their parents think, girlfriends can lose their jobs because of what their boyfriends think, then we are in this very, very dangerous terrain. And yes, you're quite right. It is a sort of Maoist,
Exactly.
you know, a Maoist movement.
It is Maoist. It's Marxist. It's Maoist. It's fascist, and you know, which is one of the greatest ironies of all of this, that we're somehow the fascists and they're against fascism, and yet everything that they're doing is fascist. Black Lives Matter apparently is now being represented on school boards.
Yes,
it's
yes.
become an astounding thing, that the depth of indoctrination, and from
way,
Kanye to schools, it's hard to.
Can I say something just about the Black Lives Matter thing, the origin of it, which I think is quite important? Yeah. I'm sure everyone present knows this, but there's quite a useful comparison that was on my mind. One of the reasons why Black Lives Matter has done so well is because of the almost impossible to oppose name. I think it was Ann Coulter who pointed out recently that, you know, the problem with it is that there's no one saying the opposite. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the thing itself moves forward with extraordinary ease. Because if you say Black Lives Matter, it's just there's some large number of people saying Black Lives don't matter. I mean, almost nobody. I mean, I don't know of anyone in the political mainstream anywhere who thinks that or would say it. So what always happens with these movements is if you have a totally if you have a name that is set up to be basically impossible to oppose, you can do an awful lot. Now, the thing I wanted to mention that I think might be interesting is we have seen this before. And one thing that's quite recent in this is peace studies. During the Cold War, a number of universities suddenly had peace studies departments. Peace studies was a Soviet invention, often Soviet funded, almost entirely Soviet funded as I understand it. And the peace studies departments came up and they had exactly this benefit. My point is, it's a trick we've seen before, because the peace studies department was like, well, why would you be against peace? You know, and of course they suggested that there are departments of war studies, but departments of war studies aren't advocating war. They're not in favor of war. They're not just for how much war can we have this year. And
go war. Right.
Whereas the peace studies departments had a very political, still do where they exist, have a very political point. But the point is the amount that you can smuggle in using this impossible to oppose name as effectively your shield, behind which you can carry out much more important operations.
You mentioned also social justice, same kind of thing. How can you be against, how can you possibly be against social justice?
You for social injustice?
Right.
It's the same with the, almost every bully argument of our day uses this very passive aggressive technique of presenting itself as a very desirable thing, but coming up with a lot of very undesirable, or at the very least highly controversial policies behind it. It's a very, very clever trick. And it's clever because even when you know it's the trick that is going on, you have to do at least a moment's work to get the terrain back to a level ground. And by that point, you're behind on making the point you need to make.
And it becomes almost impossible. You're kneecapped from the get-go, right?
Yeah, it's quicksand. It's basically quicksand.
That's a great way to think about it. It is.
And before you know it, you're saying, well, of course I think that Black Lives Matter. And then why don't they? Why do you think they don't? Why do you have to assert they do? And what's wrong with you? And this is how it works.
Any ideas for a linguistic trick we can use back?
I've done that quite a lot over the years. And you're right to ask. This requires. I'm not sure I know this, but I think we all need to work it out as we go along. I encountered the same problem with the term multiculturalism, which I wrote about quite a lot in The Strange Death of Europe. Multiculturalism was also a very hard word because it meant different things to different people, and it was designed that way. It was designed, as I think Mark Stein first said, to be basically unoppositional. You know, or what are you for? Uniculturalism? and of course, you know, and that suggests that, you know, in the case of Britain, you know, you only want to, I don't know, you don't think, if you were unicultural in that context, they sort of think, well, that must mean you don't want to eat any foreign food. You only want to eat English food. You only want to hear English, but you don't actually thinks like this. But the thing was set up so that if you were opposed to multiculturalism in any of its aspects, you seemed to be for this horrible unicultural, sort of stale and indeed bigoted thing. We saw it also with the term Islamophobia, which I pushed back against a lot in the last couple of decades. And one of my ways of doing this was to try to, with not very much success, mainstream the opposite, Islamophilia, and to say, well, okay, some people might have a phobia, but you have a philia then, and that has some utility. With the Black Lives Matter thing, I think it will. My own view is that. So there's a way I've started to express this, which I'm sort of still in the early stages of, but I think that the way to explain it is we are being offered Black Lives Matter as if it is a software upgrade on our system. And what we need to realize is that it isn't, it's malware. It's
By
designed.
software upgrade, you talk about things that are hardware, like race.
Well, I'm actually on this occasion. I'm actually talking in computer terms.
Yeah,
Well, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, we should maybe get onto the hardware software thing in that sense. But what I'm saying is that it's being presented to us as download all the correct books into your brain.
Right.
Use the correct language in the updated language file. Think and say the right things, and we will get to the program upgrade that we want to get to, which is more equal and more fair and much more. And as I say, I think one way that I'm starting to understand at the moment is to say, no, this actually isn't going to upgrade our societal software. It's going to corrupt the whole program that we're working on. Because it seems to me, at any rate, that in each of these issues, you can't do them this hard without causing other problems. For instance, if I always said that you can't have the war of the sort of men against women war without there being consequences down the line, such as, for instance, women creating men that they don't want.
Exactly.
Or making misandry acceptable, or indeed somewhere down the line making misogyny understandable, actually. And I think this is a case in each. I say the same thing in the gay chapter about that if you keep sort of implying that heterosexuality is a sort of boring, tedious, who would want that sort of thing, you might get a backlash down the road there from the majority of the public, and I think this with the race one in particular, which is the obvious one lurking, is I think you can't lean this hard on the race thing, talking about people who happen to be white as the possessors only of these demonic hereditary traits, without causing somewhere down the line white identity politics to resurface in an acceptable manner. And it could become acceptable as a response to it. So I think that is one of the many things we're staring at now, because I just don't think it's going to work. I don't think you can say to majority populations that they should remain silent, for instance. I don't think they will just agree that on almost every major issue they have no right to speak. I think it's a wicked thing to imply to any racial group or any group of people. And I know that it just cannot work doing that to majority. I don't think it could work or would be remotely moral to do it to a minority population, but to do it to majority populations seems to me not just immoral, but incredibly unwise.
And you cite that exact thing happening at the Yale confrontation. You don't get to speak. I mean, literal silence, literal. It's not just implied. It's you literally don't have a voice. And somewhere, one of the people in our group was saying they were invited to some organizational meeting, but if you're white, you literally do not get to speak. It's not implied. It's fact. And obviously there will be a backlash.
And there will be enormous resentment from this. And it's just hard to see how it could be otherwise. You see, one of the things that I wrote about this in The Strange Death of Europe, as you know, Karen, is that I've always been very interested in this concept that our age has landed on about guilt. Partly because of this interest in the ethics we lose and don't recognize we're losing, and the loss of the sins of the father ethic. The extraordinary thing about this is that in The Strange Death of Europe, I say somewhere, there was something odd that has happened in all of our lifetimes, whereby every non-Western culture ended up being judged by its best moments, and all Western culture only by its worst.
Right.
So that all Western culture was suddenly typified by the Holocaust. So that even in Britain or America, which fought Nazism, somehow the Holocaust was us as well, those perpetrators. And that's a very dishonest move, and a really outrageous move, actually. But it's particularly outrageous if it happens at the same time as you say other cultures are represented by only their best things. So that, for instance, the Islamic Neoplatonists, who were partly responsible for the transmission of texts from the ancient world coming back to us, that the Islamic Neoplatonists were typical of Islamic civilization. Indeed, the most typical thing. And I think if you play those two things together, this is a very sinister thing, because you say some people we will look at in a spirit of admiration and some in a spirit of real hatred. And then history just becomes our sort of playground to pick things and throw at certain groups. And this is what we see now with this extraordinary ahistorical historicism of the last month, where people are looking at our history. I see our, as British and American people, our history, and are doing it in the manner of somebody who is the judge, who is the jury, who is the statue executioner. It's rather like, I know you said there's that episode of Blackadder, at Blackadder season 4, where the judge is wearing the black cap before they've heard the evidence, and somebody says, shouldn't you not wear the black cap until we've heard the evidence? He says, we have no time for that. These people have already put on the black cap to view our history before knowing anything about our history. So that Britain, which has always felt some considerable pride in being the first country to ban slavery, and not just to ban it in Britain, but across the British Empire, suddenly is looked at as if we must only be judged by the fact that we had slavery. But this is not a reasonable estimation of our history. It's not an honest estimation of our history, because if we're going to play that game, we could point to the fact that every society on earth had slavery, that we happen to be, the first in the modern era to abolish it, and then you would also say, well, also, if we're so bothered about slavery suddenly, why aren't we looking at slavery in the Far East and the Middle East and Africa at the moment? In fact, I sort of joked about this in the Telegraph the other week. I said, what might our successors pull down of ours, and what might they look at in our culture? And I think that the thing that succeeding generations of ours might look at in our culture and be totally baffled by is, how come in 2020 all these Americans and British people suddenly got incredibly exercised at slavery again? And how come they were so exercised by slavery that they pulled down statues of people from 200 and 300 years earlier who had any connection with slavery, whilst wearing T-shirts made in slave shops in the Far East? And they will say, did they not know this? And then they'll discover that we did know it, and down our statues will come in turn.
Right. Dishonesty really does seem to be one of the key elements of all of this. Facts literally don't matter. We're told facts don't matter. They're not only tearing down statues of people with some tangential, or maybe not tangential, association with slavery, but also of people who fought slavery, black regiments, Miguel de Cervantes. I mean, right? The ignorance of all of this is stunning. So it's not really, the agenda isn't about racism in this, getting back to, the agenda is destruction.
That's what I think. And I think that we have to counter it at an equally deep level. You see, I've often noticed in sort of culture war-like issues that what happens is that, broadly speaking, the left speaks at a very deep level to its followers, and the right speaks about technical things in response. So somebody whips up a crowd of people to pull down a statue, and the right, let's say, says, hang on, that's the wrong statue. That person didn't do this. The other guys have got a mob and great big chains and things, and they've got hammers, and they're all fired up. So one of the questions on my mind in this thing is, what would be the thing at an equally deep level. Now, by the way, I have this with, I've suggested this in the past with the inequality debate. When people talk about inequality, particularly on the left, we've been around the inequality debate a lot in the last few decades. We did it in the 70s, much better than we've done it recently, post-Piketty. But inequality cannot simply be answered by conservatives talking about percentile GDP or anything like that. The inequality debate is in large part motivated by a very deep feeling, and that is envy. And in order to counter a deep feeling, you need an equally deep feeling. Now, I would say that in the case of inequality, that is aspiration. Envy is countered by aspiration. Now, on historical issues, what we're dealing with here is resentment. And you cannot, Roger Scruton was very, very eloquent on this, always very important thinker on this. He identified this in Paris in 1968 when he saw the student uprisings there. So this was a spirit of resentment. Now, you cannot counter resentment simply by better history teaching. What I think should happen on this is that, yes, we do argue on the history, but we also have to explain the importance of pride. You see, I at any rate, I mind the statue toppling in my own country because it's not that I don't go along with specific I'm happy to hear historical arguments. And by the way, when they say, as they have in recent weeks, we never had the discussion about slavery, we've never really had it in the open. The historian David Starkey said yesterday, what are you talking about? Our country tore itself apart on this issue. And my goodness, how America did. So when people say, we never really addressed the issue of slavery in America, what? You fought a civil war on this issue. There is no bigger way that you address anything than that households turn against each other and states against each other and people kill their fellow countrymen. That is addressing something. That isn't nothing, the Civil War. You know, and so the point I wanted to make was, we don't just argue it and litigate this, as it were, on those terms, but also on that much deeper level. And you see, if you look at the polling in the UK, I'm fairly sure this is the same in the US, but in the UK certainly, the polling that has been done shows that the vast majority, high 80% of the public, have no desire to see this statue war happen. And so why does the minority manage to survive? It's because not enough people make the point about societal pride that needs to be made. And you see, my view on this is a quite straightforward one, which is we aren't where we are as societies by accident. We are as we are as societies because of who went before us. And if they had made other decisions, we might be in a different place at the moment. I had a conversation with a minister in Norway a couple of years ago, and I was there for the Norwegian translation of Strange Death. And she said something really interesting to me, because we were talking about historical guilt and all these sort of things I wrote about in that book. And she said something so interesting. She said, Douglas, we in Norway have roughly the same energy reserves as Venezuela. But there is a reason why we are not Venezuela. And that we have a huge wealth fund from the energy resources. Because we made good decisions. We made better decisions. We made more responsible decisions. Now, here's the thing. One of the great oddities of the iconoclastic moment that we're going through is that people don't say, our countries, Britain, America, are countries people break into. They try on a daily basis to break into them. They try legally, and many people try illegally. People do not try to break in legally or illegally to very unpleasant societies. So, why don't we agree that the direction of the footfall globally, and has been throughout our history, certainly throughout American history, has been that the world wants to come to America, and that might be, at least in part, because our past got us to where we are. So the past cannot be as completely horrible and terrible as it is said to be now, or we would not be this country that the world wants to come to. And I think that needs to be said far more. And I think that it's in the hearts of most Americans,
Yes.
as it is in the hearts of most British people. And I think we need to speak to that part of the heart.
And lead with pride, not retreat in shame, which is what's happening constantly right now.
I'm sorry, and let me just, one other tangent on that. Well, the one that really interests me in the UK is the Churchill War, which has broken out. And I think there's something very telling about the fact that they have selected Churchill for this iconoclastic moment, because until, 15 years ago, we had this program in the UK where you could vote on the greatest Briton. People presented television programs on the top candidates, and unsurprisingly, the person who the British public voted was the greatest Briton of all time was Winston Churchill. So how do we go in 15 years from that to this? And the answer is because of this very strange new form of history, which has been imbibed by the post-historical internet generation. And it says that if somebody is found to have done one thing wrong once by our modern lights, they are not a good person. So if we find that there were figures in history who wouldn't have supported gay marriage, out they go, because they don't fit our values anymore.
Right.
If we find that there were people in history who were not proto-female emancipation figures, out they go. If and you can do this on every issue, and of course this is a bizarre, in my way to look at history, because history isn't just there for us to select good guys and bad guys and so. But the Churchill one is fascinating because it shows up the game that's being played. Because you would have thought that, I mean, obviously Churchill critics would dispute this, but you would have thought that being the person who single-handedly held the line against Nazism in 1940, and it just wasn't the case. It just wasn't the case that anyone else in that position of prime minister at that point would have made that stand. Absolutely not. Anyone who makes that claim, and they are trying to make it at the moment, some other guy would have been prime minister. So what? Doesn't know what they're talking about. This is a very unusual concatenation of events, and indeed, I always find very moving the reflection that one member of Parliament at the time, Lord Hailsham, said subsequent. He said the arrival of Winston Churchill, the return of Winston Churchill, his arrival at the top office of state at that point was, he said, the only time that he had seen the hand of God intervene in politics. Now, whatever your view of how that set of events came about, you would have thought that it counted for something. You would have thought it counted for something. And this generation is saying, no, no, no. For instance, Churchill drank too much. I mean, not everyone thinks that's such a sin, but there we go. Anyhow, but he drank too much. He was a bit of a drinker. Other people say the Bengal famine. And by the way, Andrew Roberts, Churchill's most recent brilliant biographer, says they're totally wrong on the Bengal famine stuff. And then they point to this incident in Tony Pandy in 1911, where the police went in and one man was killed. And they say, look at that. So here's the point. If you make one mistake once, it doesn't matter if you single-handedly stood up to Nazism at the darkest moment of the 20th century, you're still toast. Now, at that point, you can say, what is really going on here? Because this doesn't seem in any way a fair balance sheet you're drawing up.
Right.
And I think that is the point. It isn't fair. It isn't meant to be fair. They're not trying to come to a reasonable estimation of history. They're trying to demoralize everybody. That's why they've chosen Churchill. That's somebody you can unite people around. So they've gone for a high-level target. It's a very sinister movement, this, that we're dealing with.
It is. It's sinister and it's deep, and it's, as you had said, it's the tentacles really are permeate absolutely everything, and it gets harder and harder to fight back.
Yeah. Well, as I say, demoralizing your opponents is a very good tactic. By the way, there's one other point on that demoralization is worth making, which is I have a lot of sympathy for the generation growing up at the moment who are trying to find their way through this, because I speak to a lot of them. I have quite a lot of them among my readers and followers and things. And it's an enormous privilege, actually, because I think they're having a very rough time. And I don't by any means underestimate what they're going through in an age which forgets nothing. You know, I mean, most of us grew up in an age where some things got forgotten, you know, and nothing they do will ever be forgotten. And this is a very dangerous moment, because it means slip up once and, you know, your whole life, you live with it. And it's always before you. And this makes acting in the world, as I say in The Man of the Crowd, very dangerous, very, very, very remorseless. So one of the things I think is important also about this is that they've selected Churchill, I think, because it says there's no point in doing anything great in your life, aspiring to anything great, because it won't count.
Oh.
You see, if even defeating the Nazis isn't on the plus side of your ledger, why the hell do anything? You know?
Exactly right. Exactly right. So just from the get-go, don't bother.
Exactly.
And
why don't you just drop out and accept the moral river of our time flowing over you? Don't resist it.
And you're seeing students or young people saying exactly this. Why bother? Or we just...
I think this is very striking thing going on, which is the don't put your head above any parapet. Because, I mean, don't even do it on social media. You know, for God's sake, don't do it on your social media account. Don't like something that isn't totally right, done by somebody who's always been totally right. Don't make a joke about this. Don't resist anything in the movement. I saw a rather moving photo yesterday. Somebody posted of a single girl on her team somewhere in America, still standing. And I'm very, very keen that we encourage that sort of, I'm not just saying on this occasion, I'm saying we should actually say, no, the deep conformity of the age that is being forced upon young people would be actually unpleasant, whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
It's bullying. It's actually against individuals and individualism. It irons out all interesting human traits and interactions. And so it would be undesirable, whatever it was. But it seems to me that we should be trying to encourage and celebrate dissidents in this era. To say, look, we recognize dissidents in the past as being, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, being admirable people. We admire the dissidents of Eastern Europe.
Yes.
And now is a good time for dissidents. And that's something I really encourage among young readers and others, which is be careful, for God's sake, be careful. Don't go off like wildly early and unprepared and not knowing what you're getting into. But start to work out how you don't go along with the flow of the river of your time.
And this is a different, we hear a lot about how they're being trained, we're all being trained to use one's various victimhoodness, whatever victim card one can play. But this is an entirely different kind of thing, the demoralization. It's not even using your victim card, it's just nothing has meaning. It's part of the nihilism or nihilism that we're facing. It's a
profound part of it.
Right?
Yeah, and by the way, there was a very interesting example in American popular culture the other week. One of the things, as you know, Karen, I try to do in the Madness of Crowds is to recognize, you know, I'm a writer, and so I like writers, and all writers like to trace all major developments in human history to writers. You know, it's a, it's a rather
Of course.
rather predictable. You know, it doesn't matter if a book has a print run of 500 copies, we still think it changed the course of human history.
The right 500 copies. Yeah.
Exactly. But so we all have this tendency. But I'm interested in the popular culture aspect of it, because I recognize that although ideas matter, when ideas go out in popular culture these days, they're not just hundreds of millions of people in America, but billions of people worldwide that imbibe them. So these very important, like the Kanye West thing, the very important moments when the whole thing can spin on what happens in a few moments with a certain person. These things are the moments of our time when everything sort of changes, and we're going through at the moment almost on a daily basis. We're seeing that risk moment start to emerge. You know, we all know that if one protest goes more wrong, it can go one way, or if it goes, somebody said, I think it was Van Jones said the other, that if one more American cop is seen brutalizing a black man in America, it's over, sort of thing. You go, but as Sam Harris said, you know, there are 10 million interactions between the American police and the general public every year. The Republic can't rely on those odds. But the reason I mention this is because popular culture really, it interests me enormously what, for instance, the late night talk shows in America say. Because these are, you know, I mentioned recently that all courts always had their jester, but only America in the modern era thinks the jester should also issue the sermon. And James Corden, the other week on his show, just after all of this kicked off post-Minnesota, said something very, very important. He wasn't correct, but what he said was very important because of what it signified. And James Corden said, it is not the job of black people to sort out the racism. He said, black people cannot deconstruct a problem they didn't construct. But here's the thing. Nobody alive constructed any of this. Nobody. So if you say one group of people doesn't have responsibility, it means another group does. But where the hell do you go with that? And for how long? And what are people meant to do? Now, as I say, my suspicion is that what is happening is people are keeping their heads down. Mm-hmm. They're saying, I'll just do, they're becoming submariners in the era. That's what a smart young person is trying to do. They're trying to go below the water and not get noticed. But I don't know how long that lasts. But what I do know is that it is not a natural instinct to feel shame and hatred and dislike of yourself, everything around you, your family, your faith, your culture, everything that got you where you are. It's not, you have to be taught that. It doesn't come naturally. And so I'm confident on this one that if this was correctly reoriented, people who oppose this culture of resentment actually have a lot more on our side than our opponents do.
I hope so. I hope we can reorient it to pride. What worries me a little bit is while all that shame is absolutely true and it is not how we are meant to be, I fear a little bit that Black Lives Matter gives them something to be proud of. And yes, a new kind of family and a new purpose. We all need purpose and a new an energy to, right, to make good change, that be the change you want to see in the world.
That's right. And of course, I mean, it is an enormously religious movement. I mean,
it is now, a religious movement.
Anyone who doubted that should of course just watch that video of, did you see this the other day, of the white men flaying themselves in the street?
I saw enough of it.
That is quite a video.
Yeah.
And black Americans going over to them and saying, "What are you doing? Stop it. We don't want you to do this." I mean, flagellance on the streets of America in 2020. Wow. Wow. But you could see it getting there because it had all of the other things. It had guilt, it had atonement, it had original sin.
Right.
This is, and I've written about this in the past, that there's a very good book by a very smart young Jewish writer in America. I don't know what's his name. He wrote a book on the way in which Judaism, particularly in West Coast Americanism, had become this sort of social justice movement. I forget the name now in Hebrew. Anyhow, there is an
Tikkun Olam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that this is a way in which Judaism comes to a sort of liberal, what would you call it? Sort of social justice activism. And I've seen some of this firsthand in your part of the country there. And I think something similar is happening in Christianity, of a sort of the true incarnation of Christianity is without God, but with the virtues as we see it of the religion still being in place. And this is a very tricky corner. And yes, I mean, the people, I was doing a show on Sky Australia the other night, and they showed all these clips of particularly of American white women screaming at the police, for instance. And it just reminded me of that central thing. Of course, in order to behave really, really reprehensibly, you always have to think you're acting in the good. Acting really, truly reprehensibly, you've got to think you've got good on your side. But these people, I mean, how can you find yourself screaming in the street at a black policeman, or indeed in that one case of that guy, I think in Seattle, a white guy with his top off, using the N-word against a black cop in the name of anti-racism? I mean, we are in a sort of a religious moment. For me as a historian, it's very interesting because there are times like the iconoclasm of the Reformation, which I never quite understood before. And now we see the Archbishop of Canterbury saying, well, there are statues that we must take down in Canterbury Cathedral. And you think, okay, here we go again. Happens about every 400 years. And off they go. All in the name of good and of improvement. There is something profoundly religious about it, to do with the search for meaning.
Right.
I think that the thing, as I say, I'm always interested on these occasions, how can we get them to an exhausting, the place they will end up, and get them there faster in order that it stops. Right. Now, I used to say this when the statue wars broke out in a little way in Britain about 15 years ago, and it was suggested that a couple of statues in Trafalgar Square had to come down. And Roger Kimball and I were at something, and we agreed that they would end up coming for Nelson on the top of Nelson's column. And how would we defend Nelson? We said, well, we could say that he's a member of the disabled community, because, of course, Lord Nelson was one arm down on the normal number and also had 50% of the normal eye quota after one of his encounters with the French. So we could say that he deserves to be up there for that reason. Well, in this latest round of the statue wars, even Nelson being disabled hasn't done any good, and they're already saying that Nelson should come down. Now, of course, in America, you have this in a much clearer version, and it's the version that's hitting Yale and elsewhere, which is, how serious are they actually, and how serious are we? Now, I know some liberals in America who find the Yale one a sort of no point. And I'd be very interested to know what you think are the no points in America. As in, no, we're not going to rename Yale. Think of all the liberal people who've been to Yale. And they're up for a lot of this, but not for that. And what are those moments? Like, can we identify them? It would be very useful to do so. I thought that the founding fathers would be the no point in America. And I am rather surprised by the ease with which their statues too can be assailed.
Vigor and venom, not ease. I've had the thought of Margaret Sanger. I'm not the only one, of course, but founder of Planned Parenthood, who was an absolute racist and aligned with the KKK. She might be kind of a fun one. I also heard, just as a kind of a joke, but I don't know how much of a joke it is, Donald Trump Jr. said, great, tear them all down and we'll replace them all with statues of my father.
There's a Swedish politician who said that one of the statues in Sweden that they're talking about pulling down as a response to Minnesota, which is a totally understandable chain of causality, that the statue should come down. They should put up a statue to Greta. I don't think it was a joke.
Oh no, I heard that too. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we should just say that every statue that comes down should be replaced with a statue of Greta Thunberg. Buy statues. Buy shares in Greta statues.
Oh
now.
My word! But that's this is what a conquering army, nation, whatever, has always done. This is what conquerors do, right? The Egyptians and the Romans, they would just replace the face with the face of the conqueror, right?
That's right. And indeed, or the history of Jerusalem, where every civilization that came in and owned it and overtook each other used the stones for their own rebuilding and so on. I mean, this is indeed, I mean, this is a very historical moment that we're in. But it comes back to this thing, the central oddity is not why people do things to you, but why you allow the things to be done to you. And I am not surprised that people who dislike my country's history, should find themselves in a position of judging my whole country's history negatively. What I am interested in and disappointed in, to put it no stronger, is the fact that there are not more vocal people saying no, you do not get to pull down and assail our holy places,
right?
Which is what we're talking about here. We're talking about the holy places of our civilizations, whether we acknowledge them as such or not. When we had Black Lives Matter protesters in Whitehall at the beginning of last month, clambering on the cenotaph to the war dead, I was very, very disturbed by this moment, as I think people across my country were. And when of course, all of these times they throw up, we haven't seen enough of this, but terrible times and bad, difficult times throw up remarkable people. And often and often part of the role of getting things right is celebrating the remarkable people. The day after the cenotaph and other monuments were defaced on Whitehall with Black Lives Matter graffiti, a group of young men and women came out in the early morning to scrub down the graffiti and take it off. And it was very moving. Now, it turned out subsequently that they were members of the Household Cavalry who were just down the road, members of our armed forces, and who, of their own volition, came to clean the monuments. Now, here's the thing. One of the young women from, I think, a Black Lives Matter-like organization videoed them doing so. And you saw you had something on the federal buildings in DC, which was a similar incident. But this one was particularly pertinent to me in London. As these young men and women were scrubbing our war memorials, these young women were videoing them and saying, why are you taking off graffiti? What, you don't agree with Black Lives Matter? And they weren't saying anything. The young people doing the scrubbing were not saying anything. But one of these young women shouted at them, oh, you couldn't leave it up a few hours even because of your precious monuments. And here's the thing, is that and unfortunately, we've had a bit of a vacuum of political leadership in our country, partly because our Prime Minister had the COVID virus very badly and has had taken some time to recover. But here's the thing. What you need to say at that moment is, yes, these are our precious monuments. These are. Because there isn't a family in this land who's been here, as my family and most others have for a very long time. There isn't a family in these lands who that cenotaph doesn't stand for. Not one of our grandparents isn't somewhere
Mhm.
represented in that cenotaph and on the flags that fly on it. So yes, these are precious things, and you don't get to pull down and assault our precious things. No.
And that's that pride that you were talking about before. We really need to embrace that, not just inside, but in our expression all the
Yeah.
time.
And to remind ourselves that we have an awful lot to be proud of.
We do.
You know, I come back to this point. The world would not be trying to come to America if America was the country that it is being said to be. And what I mind most, in a way, is that an unfair depiction of America has been extrapolated out and created and now imposed on the generation as a fair and accurate representation of the country. And that, I think, is going to take a long time to undo that. But it must be undone.
It must be undone, and it will take time, and it takes a lot of us to do, and we can't wallow in this shame. And you also had mentioned before, when we think back on the dissidents of the past, we all imagine that we would have been those dissidents, except we're not enough, right? We're not speaking out enough. That's right. You're
Yes.
disappointed that not enough of us are doing those things to counterbalance what's going on.
Yes, but I think that might change. I sense that as this comes closer to people's own porches, literally or metaphorically, more people will realize this. When I started writing The Madness of Crowds, I expected most of the things I was finding. But one of the things that I was most surprised by was the CEOs, corporate world, and the extent to which it had sucked all of this up as well. I'm thinking of, Fortune 500 companies that all had implicit bias training. Now, I think implicit bias training is a totally crock pseudoscience.
And they themselves acknowledged it, right?
Two of the three people who exactly.
Yeah.
2 of the 3 people at Harvard said this doesn't do what it certainly wasn't meant to be rolled out like this. It's all a vindication of what I think Eric Hoffer said, about every good cause starts as a every good cause starts as a rights claim, becomes a business, and ends up degenerating into a racket.
A racket, right?
And this has become a racket. But corporate America and Britain doing this sort of thing is one of the things I was most shocked by, actually. And this has just exploded in the last month. The number of firms that have, doubled. And then I'm sure you all know examples, but I mean, some of the ones that have just come across my plate in my spare moments. There's an art website I like to follow, and I found last week, I thought, I'll just take a moment off. I'll just, look at that. And the first thing that came up was the prayer to Black Lives Matter, the votive offering, the "We are totally on side of Black Lives Matter," and all auction houses and art dealers. I thought, oh, give me a break. But also, But this is what everybody is. You probably know Ben and Jerry's ice cream, which I never liked myself. But Ben and Jerry's ice cream is now mainly an anti-racism organization. And this will only change if there is seen in the cost-benefit analysis to be more of a cost to these people than a benefit. I would like it if, when people said, what's the one I came across yesterday? It's a woman, this NHS trust actually, saying, we need to speak to our minority ethnic colleagues, and we need to say to them, how are you doing? And how are you? And we need to listen. I want to say, what did you do before yesterday?
Right.
Did you never speak to your Black colleagues? Did you ask them questions and then walk away? What kind of a racist were you until the day before yesterday? I want there to be, when Ben and Jerry's goes all Black Lives Matter on the front page, I want to know, Why were you a racist ice cream maker until this month?
Right.
What was wrong with you people? The pushback has to include there being a cost to doing this stuff. And at the moment, I believe the corporate world has done a cost-benefit analysis and decided that whilst there is an enormous reputational price to pay if they don't go along with it, somebody said earlier, the silence is violence.
Right.
Silence is violence, but violence is something else. Silence is violence, but violence is a peaceful protest. I want there to be recognized, actually, to be the opposite, that if you play these games, you will pay a cost down the road.
Right. And we just saw with Chick-fil-A kissing the boots of Black people, which, you know, in all of this conversation, there's nothing more racist than this. There's literally nothing more racist than saying we're going to behave a certain way to people of a certain skin color.
Yeah, it's of course, I've identified this as being what I describe as the overcorrection fallacy. Mm-hmm. We saw this in the post-Me Too moment. I gave the example of a female presenter on CNN saying to a guest, well, maybe there is an overcorrection going on, but we're due an overcorrection. And I said, yeah, well, the problem with that is, when do you know you've overcorrected for long enough? What if the overcorrection takes down your son?
Right.
Or your father? Or your spouse? What if giving up the whole issue of justice and what if that takes down someone close to you? But the point is, when would you know you'd overcorrected? When would you know, if you took that vindictive view of the relations between the sexes, when would you know that women had got away with lying enough that now men and women could both be treated as being equal in their testimony? And we see the same thing in the racial dynamic. When have we done this long enough to get back to equal? And what has to happen exactly in the meantime? When would you know you'd done it enough, and who would lead you back? And you see, I don't think that in this interpretation of history is that we live in a pendulum-like situation. And if this is equal and we were here, mm-hmm. we need to go to there in order to get back to there. But I think it's just as possible that we go back to there and end up going here, somewhere very not equal, or that it goes all the way back round, or all the way. You can't predict these things.
Right.
And I think you especially can't predict the consequences if you decide that you give up on things like fairness, mm-hmm. the rule of law, a right to a fair trial, a right to be regarded on your own merits, not because of your skin pigmentation or chromosomes or anything else. And as Miss D'Angelo, I think the greatest snake oil salesperson of our time, said in a speech a year ago at an American university that I quoted in the Madness of Crowds, she said, people who judge people by the content of their character rather than by the color of their skins are, quote, dangerous. Well,
yeah.
How do we know that this overcorrection isn't spearheaded by people like Miss D'Angelo, who believe that the dream of Martin Luther King should be exactly inverted? Maybe we'll be led by those people. Maybe they won't want to get back to equal. Maybe they're doing very nicely. She's charging $6,000 an hour to tell you how terrible you are.
Well, this does presuppose that equality is the goal. And a lot of us are thinking it has nothing to do with the goal at all, that yes. That's not the goal. The goal, is the goal is over here, that is the goal. The goal is inequality. The goal is disruption. The goal is superiority. The goal is chaos and destruction of law and order.
That's right. And of course, I mean, my own view is that I said before about this thing of having to come up with, as it were, deep counter answers to some of this stuff. I do think that on some level, again, this is the thing that Scruton was very good on, is that at some level we have to have a different, or we have to adapt ourselves to a better understanding of the world that we live in. Now, this can sound rather heartless sometimes because, you know, I think it was the late Irving Kristol, who was a wonderful man I much admired, who once said that he didn't believe in inequality being, you know, he wasn't for equality, he said. And he said at the time, he said, maybe it's a Jewish thing. He said, I just don't like it. He said, I don't like it in sport. I don't like it in economics. I just don't much like it in this world. I'm not, you know, he thought it wasn't the aim.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this can, as I say, come across as rather heartless, but what is it that the Maoists of our time claim to be trying to create? They claim to be trying to create some fair, equal utopia. Now, by the way, I mean, all utopians are dangerous because all utopians tell you that they're going to lead you to paradise, and it doesn't matter how many skulls you tread on in the process. Right. If you're going to get to paradise, it was worth it. My view is that the utopian thinking that is being encouraged is itself a very big part of this problem. And that we ought to be trying to understand our history and our present state much better. And that includes things like the following. There are all sorts of inequalities in the world, and we suffer all of them, each of us, daily. I made this joke to Ben Shapiro recently. I said, you know, Ben probably was never going to be able to be a basketball player. And I'm a bit taller than Ben, but I don't think I ever had much hope either. It was kind of ruled out for us by the universe. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that both of us by now have made our peace with this. But here's the thing. There's lots of things that we make our peace with in the world. Now, there is injustice and there is unfairness that we shouldn't make our peace with and we should find answers to. But it isn't and can't be everything in the world around us, or we will live very unhappy lives. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, there are some things in our life we should struggle over. We should struggle to protect the things we love, struggle to provide for our families and for our loved ones, and much, much more. But life is not just struggle. It isn't just fighting for political causes. It's also cherishing things, appreciating things, loving people, finding harmony with things, including the world around us. It isn't just this endless fight and struggle. And if you see life as being that, then you could fire yourself up forever because you will always find things to fight and struggle about. But it seems to me this isn't a very agreeable way to live a life. And what's more, I can't help noticing that the people who claim to be doing things for that reason are causing an awful lot of distress. Those women I mentioned earlier shouting at the black cops don't seem to me to be doing an awful lot for racial harmony. The men and women who talk about the sexes as being in this zero-sum game don't seem to be helping people to get along. So I'm reminded always of this wonderful story of George Orwell in the 1940s in a conversation with a Stalinist. And he's arguing with the Stalinist about the whole communist experiment that's going on. And Orwell says to the Stalinist, you know, various things. He says, but what about the show trials, 37? And the Stalinist agrees, well, you know, well, not everything in that was ideal. And and what about the famine? And okay, well, there are provision issues and so on. And go on and on and on. And eventually, the Stalinist says to Orwell, but you know, and this is, of course, the great cliche of all time, but The Stalinist says to Orwell, you know, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And Orwell says, where's your omelette? And this is the thing. The Stalinists never made the omelette. They just ended up standing with millions of cracked eggs and a great big bloody mess across the entire terrain that they had control over. They never made their omelette. They had the best part of a century, and all they did was wreck the whole damn kitchen. And I think that this same question has to be asked of these people. We're for social justice. Where is your social justice then? Why are you burning American cities? Why do we see the looting and the pillaging and the robbery and the violence and the vile, hateful rhetoric of your fellow human beings? If you are for social justice, where's your damn omelette? And if they tell us, we haven't made it this year, but if we do it hard enough and long enough, we'll give you the dish we promised, we have the right to say, I doubt it.
At the very least. What, another 5-year plan? When we saw with Chaz or Chop or whatever it's called, it lasted how many days with murders and so on? Okay, here's your little space for your utopia. Have at it, right?
I gather overnight Chaz has fallen. Is that right?
Chaz fell to the conquering United States Army. Right? They were given that little space, and it was complete mayhem. I don't know if you saw the pictures of their garden, but it was, you know, a 5-year-old would have done better. And it's utopian without anything.
Yeah, well, you could have one of the promises of Chaz I saw was speeches all hours of the day and night. There would be speeches. Oh God. It's a very remorseless vision that they had. I was very pleased to see one of the American police officers mentioning that at one of these defund the police rallies, they asked the police to come and police the protest to protect them. There are an awful lot of contradictions going on, and they should all be pointed out. But as I always point out, however, contradictions alone do not bring down movements like this. As we saw from the Soviet era, you can have an awful lot of contradictions and still keep going. In fact, it's built into the Marxist idea that contradictions are simply something you get through. You keep, of course we encounter contradictions. This was one of the big communist ideas. Of course we have contradictions going on. That shows that the dialectic is occurring. So it's not the case that things fall apart just because they fall apart under the weight of their own contradictions. But I would have thought that when it came to total breakdown of law and order, that people would see that what they are asking for and demanding is something that will mean that if they got it, they would ask not to have it quite fast.
And isn't this one of the signs of totalitarianism, that you're asked to say and believe things that you know to not be true? So within it is inherent in it and indivorceable from it are these contradictions.
Well, that's a very, very important point. It's absolutely central to totalitarian ideas. Not, by the way, to the true believers who are allowed to diverge quite often. Not the true believers, but the public, yes, must be said to, they must be made to say things that they cannot say and hold on to their self-respect. There's a very... there are very many moving examples of this. My friend Anthony Daniels, who writes under the name Theodore Dalrymple, former prison doctor, said that his travels in the Eastern Bloc, he constantly wondered, why are they asking people to say this? And he would work out it was because it was demoralizing. It's because it's degrading. It's because it robs you of your sense of self-worth and self-esteem. Václav Havel, the great Czech dissident and, of course, eventually prime minister after the fall of communism, Václav Havel had a very famous, moving example with his greengrocer example in one of his essays from the 70s. He says the greengrocer has to put up a sign saying "Workers of the world unite" in the window. It's sent to him by, as the goods are, by the Central Committee. And why does he have it there? Havel says the sign has to be something that is hard to oppose. And that brings us back to what we were saying earlier about the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter, what are you for? You're saying Black lives don't matter. Why shouldn't the workers of the world unite? What, you want the workers of the world to be disunited, do you? It's the same trick. But Havel says the greengrocer, ironically, the greengrocer who has the sign hanging in the shop, the sign ends up being a visible daily reminder of his own degradation and worthlessness. But in the end, he comes to hate what the sign represents ever more. I suspect that in our era, the people who are being told, why don't you do what the era demands? Say everything that Black Lives Matter tells you to say. Read the books. Chant the necessary chants. Do the knee. Do all of these things. That lots of people will be going along with it. And that there may well be in time, I certainly hope there is, a growing resentment that they seem not to have a say in this matter. And so in the end, the very thing that they keep posting on their Facebook wall becomes not just a sign of their own degradation, but a daily reminder that they don't have personal autonomy. So maybe this will happen, but one can't put too much hope in it because, of course, it took 70 years for the disaster to fall apart in the Soviet and Eastern Bloc. And that can't happen this time.
No, and tens of millions of lives, but it does seem like a backlash is happening. There is concern or hope or whatever that backlash is what they're wanting, and for these tensions right now to get hot, as it were, for the violence to escalate. And there are those who say we're responding with great temperance because we're afraid, but at a certain point, talking about guns, the number of people are arming themselves in bigger and bigger numbers. Do you think that's what they're wanting to have happen, or do you think they just don't have a longer term view aside from chaos? Or what's your sense of?
I think there's a lot of different things going on. Of course, one thing that radicals always wanted to do, this was certainly the case for the 68ers, was they wanted to prove the allegedly fascist nature of the state. So that the democratic state, particularly the police, were always on the front line of this. The aim was always that you get the police to be violent in order for that they reveal, the mask slips and they reveal the true face of the state, which is fascist. Of course, this idea fell apart in Western Europe as well as in America, in part because a generation of people who had believed that came to power. The former leftists of the 60s ended up being prime ministers and presidents, and this idea that the state was still fascist couldn't actually survive that idea. So it sort of seeped away. I think it's back. I think that particularly in America under the Trump presidency, there are a lot of people who seem honestly to have convinced themselves that America is effectively not a democracy. And I think, by the way, this is, in our lifetimes, one of the great failures of a political side. We've seen it in the UK in recent years with the post-Brexit era. In fact, it's an almost perfect replay of what's been happening in America. We're just a few months ahead because the vote was a few months ahead. But we had exactly the same thing in the UK as you have in America, of the claim that the vote wasn't legitimate, that the Russians caused it, that we were stupid, that we were racist. The whole playbook was done here against those of us who voted Brexit, just as it was done in America against everyone who voted Trump. And I say that there's something profound mistake that the left in America and the anti-Brexit movement in Britain made, which is they robbed themselves of the opportunity to understand why they'd lost. And that is a really big opportunity to miss. You know, I said in an interview with the French paper Le Point yesterday, however pro-EU you are, don't continue to pretend that the vote wasn't legitimate in Britain, because otherwise you won't have the opportunity to ask yourselves, why did our second largest contributor not see the EU as being desirable enough to stay in?
Right.
And if you're an opponent of Donald Trump's in America, and there are lots of criticisms to make of the president, but if you are an opponent of Donald Trump in America, the most vociferous, whether you're a never Trumper or a Democrat or a far leftist or anything else, why did you rob yourself of the opportunity for 3.5 years to say, let's say he's as reprehensible a figure as we think he is. Why did the American public vote for him then? What had we done to mean that they voted for a wrecking ball? And that would be a very big and profound personal rethink to make, a personal and necessary analysis, indeed a necessary analysis to come back to political power. And yet they've robbed themselves of that, because they've treated themselves instead to these lies. And by the way, one other thought on that, if I may, I was very struck recently. A friend in Britain said, do you think that Donald Trump will leave office if he loses the election? And I said, you know, one of my strongest political memories is in 2008, coming back from a visit to DC. I just happened to have seen some friends in the then George W. Bush administration. And I got back from DC, and I was at a dinner party in London where there was a playwright of impeccable left-wing credentials who, when she discovered I'd come back from DC, said, have you read the LRB this month, the London Review of Books, which is basically like the New York Review of Books. It's not about books at all. It's all just left-wing politics. And I said, no, I haven't, surprisingly. And she said, well, there's an article in there that explains that the president isn't going to leave office. And I remember saying, well, I didn't see President Bush, but from everything I hear, it sounds like he can't wait to go. He's looking forward to, you know, not having to deal with this and he's certainly not going to break the law and the Constitution and hole himself up in the Oval Office. So I mention this just because it's one of the remarkable things about American politics. The same claims keep being made about Republicans when they're in the White House. You know, do you think that George W. he's going to stay? They also he's made a special executive order which will keep him in office, right. And now they're doing the same thing on Trump, and it's the same endless replay of the same endless claims.
Right. Well, and they're all Hitler, right? We've been told.
Oh yeah, everyone's Hitler.
Right. They're all Hitler.
By the way, you've got to watch out for Hitler at the moment. There was a Conservative MP who was interviewed on the British television yesterday morning. Because nowadays, you know, obviously, you know, we're all interviewed from home, and you can see our bookshelves, and you know, you have to move your books around to make sure you've got the right literature on your shelves. I've got a copy of the Quran I usually keep right over my shoulder just so that no one can criticize me. But no, this Conservative minister had the 2-volume Ian Kershaw Life of Hitler on a shelf somewhere up there, and a Labour Party activist on Twitter said, yet another Tory MP not hiding his Hitler book collection. So apparently now you're not even allowed to have books of history, right. Because if you have books on your shelf, it means you voted for them almost. It's a very strange thing we're getting to here.
Talk about deranging. I just have to tiny digression. I was just listening again last night to the book, and you said somebody had mentioned Hitler's Mein Kampf, and you said not just anybody's Mein Kampf.
Yeah, that's right. Not just any old Mein Kampf. Hitler's Mein Kampf. That's the worst of them all.
That's the worst of
yeah.
That's
There's some terrific other Mein Kampfs. I mean, you got, yeah. No,
right.
yes. I can't remember who it was who said that I quoted, but I mean, the historical ignorance of some of the people that we're talking about here. I'm always I love the sort of presumption. I always say after ignorance comes presumption. I'm always reminded of this wonderful story that Mark Stein told some years ago, and on a panel together somewhere. And Mark said something. He said shortly after 9/11, he ended up having to sort of look at something he had to look at something up in, I think, the local university at Dartmouth or something. And he goes to the university library, and there's already a protest, and all these students are standing around. They're saying no war, war. And he goes over and he speaks to them. And one of them says no war. He says, well, what's your point? War leads to this. This leads to that. That leads to that. And Mark said, oh yeah, what's the capital of Saudi Arabia? Nothing. And I sometimes wonder if one shouldn't just do that. It's just, when people say we're pulling down this statue, just say to them, give me the names of 3 founding fathers.
Right.
Give me their birth dates. Tell me. You say that there's somebody in America who does that with campuses, goes around with videos, very, very successful. Goes to campus and says, how many Jewish states do you think there are?
Will Witt, there's a handful of them.
Yeah, Will Witt does some of it. And how many Jewish states are there? 1, 23, or 59? And you see these people going, I reckon it's 59. And you go, and then what do you want to do when you grow up? I want to work for the United Nations. Well. It is a very important thing, this, to recognize we're dealing with ignorance plus presumption.
Plus righteousness.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the great thing, isn't it, about ignorance, is that nobody was as good as you are. It goes back to this terrible historical misunderstanding. That's why I say, I have an editor here in London at the Spectator magazine who said to me some years ago that the job of a writer in this era should be to work out, since every era in human history has done things that we look back at and we say, wow, what were they thinking? Why did the Victorians put kids up chimneys? I mean, did they not know? I mean, you look at these things and you think, crikey, wow. Well, since that's the case with every era in history, assume that we're doing some things now. And instead of spending your time joyfully acting as, judge, jury, and statue executioner over everyone in the past, why not try to work out what we are doing now that future generations will look back at with horror? Right. I think that's and that, by the way, that's one of the reasons why I mind the waste of energies that the identitarian left is making us all engage in, is whilst encouraging us to play these unwinnable games, equality, the hierarchies of inequality and so on, and where can you speak and where do you have to not speak and so on. Instead of that, we could be doing some really interesting things. I mean, we live in, it's easy to focus on the downsides, but we live in an era where the entire planet could focus on a problem and solve it. So what's happening in our era? I said this recently. I went to see some friends in Oxford. I said to them, what was troubling them most? And I said, we worked out what was most on our minds was this whole planet of ours spent the best part of 2 months focusing on COVID, and we didn't solve it. And in fact, in some ways, we sort of made it worse. We sort of added identity politics into it and then went haywire. And we spent the last month talking about policing in America. And what have we solved? It's almost like the eye of Sauron that can focus on one thing at a time, but just makes it worse. And that's one of the things I mind about what the distraction that the identity politics people are causing is, think of the good we could do as a people at this stage in our history. We could be solving enormous problems.
How to live underwater, I think, was one of the things that you had talked about, right? All kinds of...
I mean, endless things to do, food production issues, right. Or diseases, never mind issues of purpose we could get onto. But you know, if we live in this era, I think it's one of the most exciting things in our time. I was in Reykjavik last year for an Icelandic translation of a book, as you do, and I was stopped in the street by a young guy, must have been about 20 or so, with his girlfriend, and it turned out they'd seen me on a YouTube channel a few days before, and we had this great conversation, and I just walked away from it thinking, this is amazing. Here I am in Reykjavik, and I've just had a conversation that I could have had with a young guy or girl at Harvard or at Oxford or in any mega city around the world. And if you're smart and you've got an internet connection today, you can be at exactly the point of the cusp of any discovery or any discussion. So why don't we do good things? Why don't we have meaningful discussions? Why don't we make some things better? And instead, as I say, you know, this whole era is dominated by people telling us to play unwinnable games that make us stupider.
They do, but do you think that maybe it's because they're not interested in solving any of these problems? Yes. I mean, right? I mean, yes. That's the only thing, that they're not interested in solving COVID. To the contrary, they're loving the legitimacy it can give them of totalitarian overreach in our cities, our counties, our states. Right, and this is around the globe.
I would predict with fair certainty that there will be warnings of a spike every time there's about to be a Trump rally.
And we're in one now, and the rallies have been canceled. We're here in LA.
Whereas, of course,
locked us down again.
And we know, of course, that Black Lives Matter protests only improve the virus.
Of course.
I'm sure you're aware.
We're living in, I think you're right. We're in a time when great things can be done. So on the right, we can fight these things, but we should also maybe take more seriously efforts to solve some of these actual.
Yes. And also, you know, I think that one of the most important things, I return to this issue of what a young person is meant to do in this age. And, you know, even when I was growing up, if you didn't have the money to buy a record or a CD, you didn't know how the music went. And if you didn't have the money to buy a book, you didn't know what was in the book, unless you had a lucky lending library nearby or something. And today, a young person has access to all of the music that has ever been written and all the books that have ever been written, basically for free.
Right.
Basically for free. They don't have to save up their pocket money for it. The whole world as we had it is available for free. And I return to this point that why in that case have we allowed a generation to imbibe victimhood and spend no time on gratitude?
That's it, isn't it? And that comes with the pride. That's the pride part also.
Yeah, and of course, if you know what's gone before and you have a reasonable estimation of it, and you have some pride to it, here's the most important thing. The most important thing of that is that there is a tradition from which you come and to which you can add. Because if you know the story of what got you to here, you know not only you've got examples of who you could be and of what you might aspire to and human greatness, but you know that you could write a chapter yourself. And that is a very, very important, perhaps the most important thing to encourage. What I said at the beginning, the counterweight to the culture of resentment is the aspiration to aspire to be a part of that. Now, that is something. That is a thing to do with your life, and a very, very admirable thing to do. And that's not what people are being told. They're being told everything up till now was terrible, and now we must struggle.
This is the micro of America being judged by the handful of bad things that we did versus other countries which predominantly did bad things but are being identified with a handful of good things.
Yes.
Many of us see our lives as something to be grateful for the most
Yes.
part, with a handful of things, you know, that are rotten. But gratitude is our predominant feeling, where on the other side, it's resentment that's the predominant feeling, and nobody's telling them, yes, but you have these things to be
Yes.
grateful for.
Well,
see
you
an
know, that's it's
analog?
a yes, and in a way, particularly on the right, this is too little addressed, and there's lots of reasons for that, I think. But one is that it is. I've often wondered why the right in America and Britain in particular has always been so dominated by the economics and so little by the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you know, I think the economics matter enormously, but it's no good having control of one department if you've lost all the others. And but one reason I think that has come about is that it's in some ways is one of the easier arguments. Any economists present, please forgive me for saying this. I by no means underestimate the labor that has been put in to arguing for free market economics in recent years. But the deeper cultural issues need to be talked about by conservatives and are hard to talk about because they involve talking about love. And this is simply not as, it doesn't come to people as easily in some ways. Why? I thought about this quite a lot. I think that it may be because a lot of, particularly of conservatives, think, well, that's something for the private sphere. You know, I tell my wife, my husband, I love them. I tell my parents, but I don't need to have that out in public. Now, I'm British, so anyone with that instinct, I have it squared. But as somebody once said to me in church, that whenever somebody started talking to them about the love of Jesus, they felt like they'd taken all their clothes off in front of them. And I remember thinking, crikey, and that's in church, somebody thinks that. So there is an added set of manias that we have in Britain in this regard. But having tried to teach myself out of them, I can say with some honesty that I do think we need to speak better about what we love and what we cherish, because otherwise it goes like that thing of all of the music and all the books we can get for free. It goes into just that thing of things. Yeah, of course we got that. Of course we got all that. But actually, you know, take the level next after the statues, which is the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
The obvious thing to pull down after the statues are the buildings, because if the money came from a bad place, we shouldn't have the buildings. And that is the point, perhaps, where we can say, I don't doubt that some of the people who built Chartres Cathedral were not given overtime. I think it reprehensible. I think it's an enormous shame if they didn't have a fully built-in pension package. And I'm sorry that they were treated roughly as well as the average Qatari worker is today. I'm sorry to hear that. But, ladies and gentlemen, Chartres Cathedral, you know, I don't doubt that not everybody involved in the design of Notre Dame had exactly the correct views on equality of the sexes or gay marriage. I'm so sorry to hear that. But, ladies and gentlemen, Notre Dame, this isn't nothing.
Right. But actually, when it was burning, many of us, Notre Dame, many of us, it was a visceral pain.
Yes.
And to many, it wasn't. At the time, I taught at a French school, and you would have thought that they would have been beside themselves about it, but they weren't. And then the conversations about how do we rebuild? Do we make it a multicultural center with sustainable, you know, energy and all of this, or madness?
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, is that people can to a great extent with the environment around them, particularly with buildings around them, they can get used to them very easily. It's another of these things.
Yes.
It's the same thing with the natural environment. If often you will have had the experience, as I have, of going to a particular part of the world to see friends or to meet new people, and you see, I don't know, an unbelievable sunset or a particular piece of scenery, and you say, wow, and they say, what are you looking at? And then you realize, of course, they've just got used to it.
Right.
Well, to a great extent, that is the situation that we are in our countries. We think that the rule of law is like the sunset. It's just there. And we got used to it. We think that the dreams of American democracy and British democracy were always just there. We got used to it. We got used to our beautiful cities and our beautiful buildings and our beautiful statues and our beautiful inheritance. And we thought it'll always be there. But if you get that sense, and I agree with you, Karen, I had as well when Notre Dame was burning, if you get that sense of you could lose it all,
yeah,
then something else occurs. Something else occurs, and something kicks in to say it isn't permanent. And therefore, if it's going to remain, it's your job to shore it up. Now, that can be, and has been in the past, an incredibly important lesson for generations to learn. That actually there is nobody else to do it. It's on you. And if you don't keep that flame alive, if you don't keep those buildings up, then down they come. But that is the saddest situation of all for people to be in, which is living in the ruins of the civilization they used to have.
And we've been watching, some of us here were in Santa Monica, which was on fire, Beverly Hills on fire. We grew up with visions of World War II, as we were told from our forebears, and to see it in our cities. Any suggestions as to what we, specifically as individuals or as organizations or politically, that we can do to not be living in those ruins?
Yes, I think the most important thing, I think absolutely everybody has a role in this, which is to speak up.
Can you tell the story of the Viper?
Yes. I tell the story at the opening of Madness of Crowds. A friend of mine in the British Army, one day as I was starting to write The Madness of Crowds, a friend of mine who'd been in the British Army described to me a defense system, which in Britain is called the Great Viper. The American Armed Forces have it as well. I can't remember the name in America, but you can see this on YouTube. It's a beautiful thing. The Great Viper is something you can pull it on a truck behind an army vehicle. You put it on a truck, and it's a large projectile missile, and you fire it across a minefield, and it's like a rocket with a huge long tail of explosives behind it, and it lands across the minefield and detonates the whole thing. So the whole minefield doesn't detonate, but it creates a path that you can go across. So when this friend from the army told me this, I said, I've got my opening. I said, you've given me my metaphor. This is exactly what I'm trying to do. My point in the Madness of Crowds was to say, okay, let's look at all the things that people fear talking about the most. And I'm going to do a Great Viper on it. And I can't clear all the mines, but I can make it a bit safer for other people to start crossing the minefield. And my experience since the book came out is that has to some extent happened. It hasn't happened with as many people as I hoped, but it has happened. I was giving a speech at a university here in the UK a few months ago when we were all still allowed outside of our houses. And the young guy who was interviewing me in front of this wonderful packed student audience, they were sitting on the stairs and standing at the back. And this young student said, I'm going to read out the contents page of Douglas's new book, The Madness of Crowds. And he looked, and there was all silence in the hall. He said, gay, women, race, trans. And I looked up at the audience and they were silent, and I just smiled at them. We all burst out laughing. They were all like, oh my God, these are all the things that, And we just had a great evening, and they had such good questions, and they were so smart, and they were of every background and every group. And I do find that, if you say to people, we can't have this post-Me Too thing going on where men and women have to fear each other like this. Like, let me put it out there. The sexes have to be able to get on with each other. Everybody, of course, everybody knows that. Okay, so how can we make this more reasonable and, less antagonistic than it's become? And I do that on each of these issues. I can do it because I'm as it were, a lone voice. I rely on my pen and my voice as my tools. I don't underestimate that it's tricky for a lot of people. In fact, for most people. Very tricky if you work in government. Very tricky if you work in the public sector. Very tricky now, increasingly, if you work in the private sector. Well nigh impossible if you work in the education sector. But it is happening. And I am very struck by the fact, I saw a friend earlier, Lawrence Fox, who's an actor who made his a debut appearance on a BBC show earlier this year, where he said things that were true, and everyone was so shocked to hear an actor say things that were true that they tried to destroy him. But his voice is enormously admired by the members of the public, who are a much larger number than the newspaper columnists and others who criticized him, or the online warriors. And I see voices like that stepping up. And what I see is that when they do, they have an extraordinary, disproportionate impact. When one person in a profession which is meant to all think the same way, as if that happens, when one person in a profession which is meant to all think the same way breaks the taboo, an amazing amount can follow. Now, it's hard. I don't doubt this. This is very hard for that person. Right. But often it's because they can't do any other. They have to say the truth.
So for us, I had derailed you with the Viper, but I thought it was relevant to what you were saying about what each of us can do is, insofar as we can.
Yes, is to do that. Is to keep your voice up in any way you can. Everybody has their communities of friends and work colleagues and others. And I think everybody has an extraordinary role to play in this. And by the way, once again, one's opponents know this, because otherwise they wouldn't be telling children to go home and re-educate their parents.
Right.
Personally, I can't help thinking that if a child of mine came home and told me that they were going to educate me, I would have something to say about that. But yes, I think everybody has their own fight going on in this. And I also think, by the way, that we can practice something that they urge people not to, which is to speak across divides. I have friends who don't agree with me. So the hell what? I mean, if all my friends agreed with me, it would be a rally, not a dinner party.
A great point.
I don't meet up with friends and say, well, again, when we could meet up with friends, I don't say, how about we all meet up to agree with each other? I say, how about we meet up for drinks and we argue about things, we debate things, we discuss things, and we have a great time. So this doctrinaire left thing of, defriend people who aren't in lockstep with 100% of your views, I think we can offer something better than that. And we say, no, actually, thank you. We'll be friends with people we regard as being, people we like and we love and have things in common with. And yeah, we'll make our voices heard, and we'll say no when we say no, and we'll listen. Fine. We'll listen, but we won't only listen. We'll also talk. A right we still enjoy for the time being. And
the fight can't be everything, as you said. There has to be love, there has to be beauty, there has to be
there was somebody said the other week, I saw on Black Lives Matter, to disown your grandparents if they don't have the right views. I say, what are you telling me? This is back to the thing. This is Khmer Rouge territory. This is Soviet territory. Inform on your grandparents. The state, no. we have to push back against that. We say, no, it is more important that you have a good relationship with your grandparents and give them the honor and the love that they deserve than that you have complete doctrinal agreement with them.
Right. It is madness, and it is deranging. We've talked for longer than we said.
Well, it's because it's been such a pleasure for me.
For me too. So amazing. I thank you so much for giving us all your time. I haven't seen questions coming up. I've seen comments. I don't know if you have any time, but I think we've covered just a tremendous. We'd love to have you on again, if that's okay.
I'd love that. I'd love that. And one day, whenever we're allowed, not just out of our houses, but to travel to other people's countries again, I hope
Absolutely.
to see you over there. It'd be a great pleasure for me.
Would really be such an honor to have you.
Well,
really.
Thank you, Karen. It's been an enormous pleasure.
A real joy. Thank you so much.
You've got all the day ahead of you, so thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
And you. Take care, everyone.